Thank you for joining me for another quick hits conversation. Today, I would like to talk about what is the difference between being in a groove and being in a rut? Can you switch from one to the other? Karen, kick us off.
Yeah, it's interesting when you started talking, when you shared the topic with us the other day, I thought one is a positive and one is a negative. So sometimes my brain is very much black and white. And in this scenario, I looked at being in the zone as very much being a positive, and it can happen whether it's athletically or whether it's work related. Had it happened in my work day, and I'm sure some of you guys probably had it happen in your work day, where next thing you know, you pick your head up and 4 hours have gone by. And so it's kind of like where you're so intently focused in on the work at hand that you cannot be disturbed. Whereas a rut, on the other hand, and I have these kind of conversations within myself where I like routine, but I don't like ruts. And when I feel that routine is starting to be a little too solid and structured, for me as a creative, it makes me just, like want to, get my way out of that box. I don't like being in a rut. If I'm in a rut, I'm immediately bored, and I'm the kid that, was in school that didn't do well when they were bored. And so I try to avoid being in a rut if at all possible. That's just kind of how I approach life in general.
Stewart, what were your thoughts when I sent this topic?
Actually, I agree with Karen. I looked at it as a positive and a negative, but I also believe that a groove could lead to a rut. And so that's why I would advocate, constant self-evaluation, either in the process or in, what you're doing, because sometimes you can get too comfortable in the groove, and the rut will come up before you know it. And that will impact your productivity. Sports teams are really successful, and even businesses are successful if they can do a self-analysis. And I'll give you an example like Kodak or General Motors, companies that were really good back in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. They didn't do a self-evaluation, and they couldn't pivot or lack the agility to change with the times. So now Kodak, they don't have a digital footprint. So, and you laugh at it, but it's true. And even General Motors has struggled. So, I mean, don't get too comfortable in your groove, because it will lead to a rut. That's my opinion.
So is there an emotional component? Could you find yourself in a rut and turn it into a groove by changing your mindset, by changing the way you feel about it? Or once you're in a rut, that's it, you have to get out or nothing?
I still contend that you have to continue to do self-evaluations. I mean, and you do self-evaluations in your life. Both of you guys run businesses, and you're constantly evaluating your business so that you can improve. Because if you continue to put out the same product, then people are not going to continue to come to you because there's no innovation. So maybe the innovation is the kryptonite to a rut.
Interesting.
So Karen, when I said you can't get out of a rut by turning it into a groove, you shook your head pretty aggressively. You think that's not how it works?
Well, here's something that came to mind about both of them. I feel like they're both unintentional. Like nobody sets out to like in athletics, and both of us have participated in sports. I don't care what you want. If you cannot force yourself into a zone.
Right.
You can kind of force yourself into a rut by just kind of like Stuart was saying, not having self-evaluation, not recognizing those, things that are happening in the world that, that you're just kind of going along autopilot. But I feel like a rut happens unintentionally, as does the zone. The thing about the zone, though, is athletes today are much more, I'm going to say this, and there's always a caveat behind it, but are much more psychologically prepared for their event than we were 20, 30 years ago. So,
yeah. Stewart, I want to go back to something you said. You said that you think that innovation is what keeps you out of a rut. Can too much innovation, like just cycling too fast, keep you out of a groove as well?
Well, that's an interesting thought. And it most likely, to some degree, is true. You have to be able to, and this is that whole self-evaluation piece, is you have to be able to not let yourself get sucked up into the backslapping, the self-fulfilling prophecy. because then it impacts your ability to do successful self-evaluation. I mean, I guess the good thing about a athlete is you get instant feedback as to whether what you're doing is working or not. Whereas the event horizon in a business environment may take longer, and you could end up in a rut before you realize it. And then are you agile enough to pivot to be able to fix it?
But you know, it's interesting when you were talking, Stewart, my mind went to some of the organizations that I've worked for that don't know how to reinvent the wheel per se, meaning that rut becomes ingrained in their culture to where they're not willing to try other things or to try something new because there's that complacency and that comfort zone with where you're at. I think that, you know, that we all have to, you know, kind of back to the self-awareness piece, we all have to kind of be aware of, you know, what is our balance in this? And this really is kind of a conversation about, is there a balance between the two that is a better place for us to operate as human beings versus one extreme or the other?
No, I think what happens is people get to they believe that they have an identity, and that identity actually and they think that that's being their groove, but that actually could be them leading to the path of their rut, because that identity is how they think that people will identify with them most collectively. But I think the most successful organizations, whether it's sports, business, or whatever, you know, when there's that ability to adjust to the environment, I use the word agility again because I like that, then it makes you more proficient at what you're doing. There's no growth. I mean, the only growth that comes from a rut is you identify the fact that you have a rut, and I got to figure out how to get out of that rut so that I can grow. Otherwise, it's just going to stagnate.
Well, is it possible that someone may be happy in their rut? And we were talking about the emotional aspect, like a rut is bad and a groove is good. Is it fair to say that I can't identify if you're in a rut or in a groove because I don't know what your perspective is? Or can I, from the outside, say to someone, you're in a rut, you need to change?
I think as a creative, when I'm working with a team, it's very obvious when somebody who is responsible for developing creative is in a rut, because when you're in a rut, you go to your go-tos, your standbys, your things you know are going to work, instead of taking that risk. And that's one of the reasons why in the creative field of marketing, you know, let's put the first 10 ideas out, the first 20 ideas out, because those are going to be the obvious ones. And then we'll get into the meat of it. And so I think that that's an important consideration as well.
My husband says the same thing, being creative. Get all the crap out, then you can start doing something useful. So in the last kind of 90 seconds that we have, I'd like to ask this question of each of you. How do you get yourself out of a rut?
I'll defer to you, Karen.
So, you know, it's interesting what I've discovered, specifically talking about my creative side, I need to see and experience things in a different way. So that means whether I need to, you know, take my laptop and go work in a different environment, whether it means I just go visit friends somewhere else, because I'm a super observant person. And those observations are really important to that creative risk that you need to take in this industry, that you can, you know, if I'm only ever looking at these same four walls, really nothing's ever going to change. So it makes it really easy to be in a rut.
It's a matter of self-awareness. And I'm just going to dovetail, I think, on what Karen said. You have to be self-aware enough to know that you're getting into a rut so that you can make that pivot and continue. And it depends on what you're doing in your personal life. You could be in a rut and be perfectly satisfied with it. But when your livelihood requires you to be constantly adjusting, i.e. in business or in sports, or even working out, you could work out and think you're doing the right thing, but your body's not improving because you don't recognize the signs that your body says, all right, I've done enough. Now you have to shock me into doing something else so that I continue to improve. So you have self-awareness is probably the catalyst to getting you out of the rut.
That's our 10 minutes. I know that we're basically saying if you're in a rut, You have to create change. That's the only thing that gets you out. So thank you for having this conversation with me. I appreciate it, and we'll do it again real soon.